Hello everyone, and welcome back to World of Warships Blitz with Terry. Somebody mentioned in the comments last week, and I thought it was a brilliant idea. Why don't I make a video about how to pronounce ships? Now, I'm not going to start how to pronounce certain ships that I'm actually not 100% sure how to pronounce them properly, but there's one line in the game that I'm probably capable of pronouncing correctly, and that would be the German tech tree. Because if you don't know, I was born and grew up in Germany, so that is sort of my native language, which means let's go through. And there are some names that might be a little difficult to pronounce. And there was actually one that mildly surprised me as well. So, or one or two. So let's go through that and get started. So this is just going to be a slightly historic / pronouncey video about where these ship names are coming from. All right, let's start at Tier 1. This is the Hermelin, which is the German word for stoat, which apparently is a sort of weasel. So Hermelin, I think it's a gunboat of some description. So that would be that thing. Following up with the cruisers at Tier 2 would be the Dresden. Dresden is a city in Eastern Germany. So that's what that ship is named after. Followed by, at Tier 3, the Kolberg. Now, Kolberg is a city in Poland, and there is a Polish pronunciation for it that I am not going to attempt. But once again, we're talking about a city here. At Tier 4, we're down with the Karlsruhe. Karlsruhe, or, Karlsrest really, is once again a city in Germany. And it continues with Königsberg. König being the German word for king, so Königsberg once again being a city. And it continues in Tier 6 with Nuremberg. Nuremberg being yet another city in the south of Germany. And now it gets interesting, because at Tier 7 we have the York. Now York, this ship as we have her here, did not exist. But there was an SMS York in the First World War, and this is a pattern you find a lot. So if Wargaming makes up ships for the German lines, they often tend to use names of actually existing ships, mostly from the First World War era, that are not actually in the game. So this ship, the SMS York, was named after Ludwig York von Wartenburg, who was a Prussian field marshal. So that's where that name comes from. And since we're at the topic of field marshals and admirals and such, the obviously Admiral Hipper, named after Franz von Hipper, who, well, needs no introduction. And here it gets interesting, because the next up is the Tier 9. And this ship, once again, didn't exist, but the SMS Rhone, and I think that is how it's pronounced, because it's named after Albrecht Graf von Rhone, who was a Prussian Minister of War and rather famous at the time. So this is, as much as I pronounce it myself, the Rune, it would actually correctly be pronounced Rhone, although I'm probably not going to keep doing that, because just switching back and forth occasionally causes me to trip over my own pronunciations between English and German. But yeah, if you want to do it correctly, the SMS Rhone are named after Graf von Rhone. And finally, at Tier 10, we have the Hindenburg. Hindenburg, once again, didn't exist, but the SMS Hindenburg did exist, and she was obviously named after Paul von Hindenburg, who was a rather famous field marshal and eventually the president of the Weimar Republic, and somewhat instrumental in getting a certain man famous for his small mustache into power. So, willingly or unwillingly. So that's the cruiser line. Now, let's quickly go through the destroyers, because there's not that many of them, because mostly the Germans were just enumerating them and didn't actually give them names. I mean, they did, but we don't have many of the named ones in-game. The first one we have here at Tier 6 is the Ernst Gede. And Ernst Gede was an actual person. He was an artillery officer, funnily enough, on the SMS Emden, which was a rather famous little cruiser during the First World War, especially around here in the Pacific region. I'm going to make a separate video about that one as well. And the second one we do have at tier 7, which didn't exist, I think, but the name is Leberecht Maas, and Leberecht Maas was an admiral, and he was commanding the SMS Köln, which was sunk by Beatty's forces in the First World War. So that is also somewhat correct. Now let's start out with the battleships. At tier 3, we have the Nassau, named after the Duchy of Nassau. And then in tier 4, we have the Kaiser, Kaiser being a German word for emperor. So the Kaiser class coming first, which is always confusing me. It should have been the other way around. Because next up, at tier 5, we have the König, which is the German word for king. So we've got the emperor before the king. Should have been the other way around, but it is what it is really. It was really like that. Then at tier 6, we have the Bayern, Bayern being the German state of Bavaria. Now it gets interesting, because this is the one that everybody keeps asking about. And I actually have double-checked just to make sure, and I am of a reasonably certainty that this is called the Gneisenau. Now there are people who are saying that the G is quiet, but this is not something we usually do in German. And she is named after August von Gneisenau, who was a Prussian field marshal. So for all intents and purposes, I'm sticking that the G is there. It is the Gneisenau. Then at tier 8, we have the Bismarck, obviously named after Otto von Bismarck, the famous Iron Chancellor. And after that, it stops once again with ships that really existed, but we have the Friedrich der Große, Frederick the Great. There was an SMS Friedrich der Große, and she was a Kaiser-class battleship, the Emperor-class, the thing that we've seen in tier 4. Then at tier 10, we have the Großer Kurfürst, the Great Elector, named after, well, first of all, the SMS Großer Kurfürst, which was a König-class, so tier 5, which is fitting. So they've actually transplanted the tier 4 in 9 and the tier 5 into 10, and named after Friedrich Wilhelm, the famous Great Elector of Brandenburg. All right, that gets us through the tech tree. So let's have a quick look at the premiums. What do we have here? We have the Admiral Graf Spee at tier 6, named after Maximilian von Spee, who was a vice admiral in the First World War. Next up, we have the Scharnhorst, named after Gerhard von Scharnhorst, the chief of staff in the Prussian army. One that people tend to get wrong, and I actually got wrong myself first. This is not the Prinz Eugen, because that would be how you would usually pronounce it. No, this is the Prinz Eugen. The stress is in the rear here. And she's named after Prince Eugen of Savoy, who was a Habsburg field marshal, and is actually of French origin. So it was probably, I don't know how they would pronounce that in French, Eugene of some sort, but apparently the pronunciation is Eugen. So it is a French origin and then Habsburg Austrian Germanified sort of name. So that's where that comes from. So it's not the Prinz Eugen, it's the Prinz Eugen. Next up, we have the Tirpitz, named after Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, who single-handedly, more or less, invented the high seas fleet during the First World War. So that's a rather famous one. That gets us through the ones that are actually shown in the tech tree, but there are a couple more. So let me just put the filter on here. And so we've done the Graf Spee. Yes, we have the Prinz Eitel Friedrich, which is named after Prince Eitel Friedrich of Prussia, who was the son of the German emperor. And I'm not 100% sure about the Eitel pronunciation, because it is a very, very old and uncommon name. But I would assume the word itself means vein. I don't think that's the meaning here in the name, but I'm not sure if there's a different pronunciation. I could be wrong here, but that's how I would pronounce it off the bat. Next up, at tier 6 here, we have the Erich Löwenhardt. Erich Löwenhardt was a fighter ace in the First World War. And that gets us to tier 8, where we have the München, which is the German word for Munich, which is obviously the city in Bavaria. We have the Graf Zeppelin, named obviously after Graf Ferdinand von Zeppelin, who was the inventor of the airship with the same name. So in German it's Zeppelin, not Zeppelin, but you'll be perfectly understood if you're going around the other way. We've talked about the Prinz Eugen, the Mainz, once again being a city in German, and now we're done with the famous admirals and field marshals. We're getting into the mythical realm because it's tier 8. We get the Odin, which obviously is the same as the English Odin. It's the Norse god. And we're going to ignore the other one there. And that kind of sort of continues with the Siegfried. Siegfried, also named known as Sigurd in the English or Nordic more slant, was a legendary dragon slayer. And there was actually a Wagner opera about this guy. So that's the thing. And lastly, or not, well, not lastly, but almost, this one I am not 100% sure. So this is it's either Aegir or the Aegir. It depends if you ask the Norwegians or the Icelandic. I think in Norway it's pronounced Aegir, and in Iceland it's pronounced Aegir. But either way, that's a Jötun from the Norse mythology representing the sea. So not a god, but some sort of divine creature. And very much at the end we have the Pommern, which is the German word for the region of Pomerania. So there you go. That's the list of German ships and how you can actually pronounce these things. The ones that caught me were the Prinz Eugen, because I really didn't know that it was not pronounced Prinz Eugen, and obviously the Rhone. I could have guessed that one, but it was just too tempting to just pronounce it Rune because it just sounds so English, you know. And I'm not 100% certain that he was pronounced Rhone. From what I've looked up, from the sources I've looked up, I think it was pronounced Rhone. But yeah, there we go. All right, that's it for today. Thanks everybody, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.